Hey there, fellow Austen fans. Ready for a deep dive? Today we're going to try and unmask the real Jane Austen. You know, the woman behind all the wit and those timeless characters. We've got some excerpts from her biography and a really cool YouTube analysis of inheritance laws in her novels.
Yeah, it's intriguing, isn't it? We're working with a bit of a puzzle here. We have these glimpses into her life, but so much about Jane Austen remains a mystery.
Exactly, like piecing together a literary jigsaw puzzle. But before we get all tangled up in entails and dashing gentlemen, I want you to picture Jane Austen. What pops into your head? Prim and proper lady, writing by candlelight. Well, get ready for some surprises. The real Jane Austen was way more complex and a lot more interesting than those early portrayals.
Oh, for sure. Those early biographies, often written by family, presented a pretty sanitized version of her. They really focused on her domestic side, her quietness, but they kind of tiptoed around some of the juicier details.
Huh. It's like they were trying to create a literary heroine out of her real life.
Mm.
Luckily, modern biographers are digging deeper, and they're uncovering a much more nuanced and, dare I say, exciting picture of Jane Austen.
Exactly. Like one thing that often gets left out is that Jane had a brother, George, and he had developmental challenges. It was common back then to send children like that to live with another family, but it definitely adds a layer of complexity to their family dynamic, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that's not all. There's also the story of her aunt, Mrs. Lee Parrott. She got caught up in a theft scandal. Seems Jane's life wasn't all tea parties and polite society.
Right. These details hint at a woman who saw a wider range of human behavior than we might think. Makes you wonder how those experiences shaped her sharp observations and that amazing satirical wit she's known for.
Now let's go back in time to the Austen family home in Steventon. Imagine a lively house full of debates, theatrical productions, and a shared love for stories. It sounds like the perfect place for a future literary genius to grow up, right?
Totally. That stimulating environment must have been so important for Jane. You can see how it nurtured her wit and her satirical voice from a young age. Even as a kid, she was writing stories and plays. She had this incredible talent for observing people and this playful way of poking fun at society.
And we can't forget about her Juvenilia. For any Austen fan, those stories and plays she wrote as a child are a treasure trove. They're full of what one biographer calls anarchic fantasies, wild adventures, parodies, and some pretty sharp social commentary for someone so young.
Yeah, her satirical novel Love and Friendship is a great example. She wrote that when she was only 14. Can you believe it? It's amazing how even then she was already mocking the conventions of romantic novels, and that's a theme she revisits so brilliantly in her later work.
Oh, and her humor is just fantastic. In The History of England, which she wrote, and her sister Cassandra illustrated, she describes Henry VIII as a very fine man, but he had 6 wives. Talk about understatement. It's clear that humor and irony were always part of her voice, and she wasn't afraid to use them to challenge the status quo.
Makes you wonder if she honed those observation skills during family gatherings, picking up on everyone's little quirks and contradictions.
Now let's talk about a certain Irishman named Tom Lefroy. He might have been the inspiration behind some of those heart-fluttering romances in her novels. Jane was 20 when she met Tom, and from her letters to her sister Cassandra, it sounds like she was totally smitten.
Ah, yes, Tom Lefroy. Those letters give us such tempting glimpses into their flirtation. There's this one quote where she describes their dancing as everything most profligate and shocking. And sitting down together, too. Quite scandalous for the time, don't you think?
It definitely raises a few eyebrows, but was she serious? Or was she playing with the language of those dramatic romantic novels? They were all the rage back then. It's tough to say for sure, but what we do know is that no other suitor seems to have captured her heart quite like Tom.
It makes you think, right? Did this unrequited love, or maybe the bittersweet feeling of young romance, did that influence how she portrayed longing and disappointment in her novels?
Such a fascinating question. Now, on a more serious note, let's not forget about the role of money and marriage in Jane Austen's world, especially for women.
Oh, absolutely. Back then, marriage wasn't just about love for women, it was about economic security. Which brings us to that YouTube source we mentioned, the one that dives into this complicated concept of entails and how they affected inheritance.
Entails. They sound a bit intimidating.
Oh, they could be incredibly frustrating. Just imagine you're a family with 5 daughters, and your entire estate is going to go to some distant male cousin, all because you didn't have a son.
Frustrating. Right. That's the reality of entail, and it's a major source of tension in Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, that's exactly what happens to the Bennet sisters. Their beloved Longbourn, it's entailed away to that will, to Mr. Collins. It's a harsh reminder of how women's futures were often tied to these inheritance laws.
It really is. It's kind of heartbreaking to think about the limitations they faced. But before we get too deep into Pride and Prejudice, can you give us a quick rundown of how these entails actually worked? Like, why couldn't Mr. Bennet just leave his estate to his daughters?
Sure. So basically, an entail was this legal document. It dictated how property would be passed down, often with the goal of keeping large estates within a family. Think of it as a predetermined inheritance plan that favored male heirs.
So even though Mr. Bennet owns Longbourn, he can't decide who inherits it after him.
Exactly. And if there are no male heirs, like in Pride and Prejudice, the estate goes to the next male relative in line, no matter how distant or how undesirable they might be.
Poor Mr. Bennet. I can only imagine the pressure he must have felt to have a son.
Right. And don't forget about Mrs. Bennet and all her anxieties. Remember that quote where she's lamenting about someone entailing the estate away from one's own daughters?
Oh, yeah. It adds such a layer of irony to the whole situation. It makes you wonder if Mr. Bennet might have signed this entail himself when he was younger. Maybe blinded by, optimism or societal pressure.
It's definitely possible. It was pretty common for these entails to be renewed or modified when a son came of age. It was a way to ensure the family line continued and to preserve the estate.
But for the Bennets, not having a son creates this ticking time bomb, this looming threat of losing their home, and that just adds so much tension to the story.
Absolutely. It really highlights how vulnerable women were in that society. Their financial well-being, their whole future, often depended on these inheritance laws and the decisions made by men.
And it makes Elizabeth's marriage to Mr. Darcy even more significant, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a romantic triumph, it's a strategic move that secures her future and the future of her family.
For sure. Knowing about entails adds a whole new layer to the ending of Pride and Prejudice. It's not just a fairy tale. It's about a woman navigating this complex social and economic world and ultimately finding a way to secure her own happiness and independence.
It's amazing how a love story can reveal so much about the norms and power dynamics of the time. Thinking about Jane Austen's own life and knowing how these entails worked and the anxieties they caused, do you think she might have drawn on personal experience when she wrote Pride and Prejudice?
It's certainly possible. We don't have all the details of her life, but we know that money was a concern for the Austen family.
Yeah, her father was a clergyman with a modest income.
Yeah.
And after he died, her mother and sisters had to rely on the support of their brothers.
Exactly. So this theme of financial insecurity and how important marriage was for women, it was very real in Jane's own life.
It's like she took those real-life anxieties and wove them into her novels, creating stories that still resonate with readers centuries later.
It really speaks to her genius as a writer, to take these complex social and economic realities and make them into such captivating stories.
And it's not just Pride and Prejudice, right? Think about Sense and Sensibility. The Dashwood sisters are disinherited because of a similar entail situation. It's a recurring theme in her work.
You're right. It seems very likely that she used her fiction to explore these social structures. Structures that limited women's choices, maybe even critique them.
It definitely makes her novels even more powerful, knowing they have this authentic social commentary. But even with these serious themes, there's also this sense of joy and resilience and wit, of course, that shines through.
Absolutely. She had this incredible ability to balance the social critique with this genuine affection for her characters, and this belief in the possibility of love and happiness, even within a rigid social structure.
Speaking of constraints, let's talk about Jane Austen's own journey as a writer. It wasn't always easy for women to get published back then, was it?
Oh, not at all. In fact, Jane initially published anonymously. Her first novels, Sense and Sensibility included, were published by a lady. It was only after her death that everyone knew she was the author.
Wow, it's incredible to think she achieved so much success without the recognition.
It really shows her talent and determination. She didn't let societal expectations hold her back.
And even after everyone knew it was her work wasn't always loved. Some critics thought her novels were too domestic, too focused on ordinary people. They preferred those more dramatic and romantic styles that were popular then.
It's funny how tastes change, isn't it? Today, we celebrate Jane Austen for her realism, her sharp observations, her ability to find meaning in everyday life. She had this gift for capturing human relationships and social interactions and making them insightful and entertaining.
And we can't forget that brilliant use of humor and irony. That's what makes her novels so witty and engaging.
She was a master of satire, using humor to subtly critique societal norms and poke fun at how we behave.
We've talked about Steventon and Bath, but not Chawton yet. That's where she moved with her mother and sister after her father died. And it's where she wrote some of her most famous books. Can you tell us a bit about Chawton and how it might have influenced her writing?
Sure. Chawton was much quieter than Bath, more rural. It seems like it gave Jane the space and stability she needed to write. That's where she revised and published Sense and Sensibility, and where she wrote Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Emma. Pretty impressive for a few years in a small cottage, huh?
It really is. It's like she found her true voice in the peace and quiet of Chawton. Now let's talk about her legacy. Jane Austen's popularity has just exploded since her death. Her novels have been adapted into movies, TV shows, plays, you name it.
Hmm.
Why do you think her work continues to resonate with people all over the world?
I think it's a few things. Her characters are relatable, timeless. We see ourselves in their struggles, their triumphs, their flaws, and her writing is both elegant and engaging. She was a master storyteller. She could take the everyday lives of ordinary people and make them feel important and meaningful.
And of course, there's the romance. Who doesn't love a good love story, especially when it's told with wit, intelligence, and a little bit of social commentary?
Exactly. She captured the complexities of love and relationships in a way that feels real. And it just endures.
Now, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Jane Austen, it's really amazing, how she managed to blend those serious themes with stories that are so fun to read. It makes you want to go back and read her novels again, doesn't it?
I know I do. And to think she did all of this during a time when women weren't really encouraged to speak their minds.
Right. It's so inspiring.
It really is. Her legacy goes way beyond books. She's a symbol of resilience, creativity, the power of stories.
We've learned a lot about Jane Austen today, from her lively childhood home to those scandalous dances with Tom Lefroy, and that whole world of entails. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have. It's been such a fascinating journey, unmasking the myths, exploring the realities of her time, diving into those brilliant novels.
I bet our listeners are going to want to pick up Pride and Prejudice again after this, maybe see those subtle social critiques in a new light.
I wouldn't be surprised. There's always something new to discover in her work.
We've covered so much, but before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a thought. Imagine you could sit down with Jane Austen. Knowing what we know now about her life, her world, her writing, what would you ask her?
Wow, that's a great question. It makes you realize that even after all this, we still don't know everything about her.
Right. What inspired her characters? What did she dream of? What were her true thoughts about the society she wrote about? It's those unanswered questions that keep her legacy alive, and make us want to keep exploring.
You said it. Maybe that's the magic of Jane Austen. She draws us in, makes us curious, leaves us wanting more.
So to our listeners, keep exploring Jane Austen's world. Reread her novels, read her letters, maybe even try writing your own stories. You might just surprise yourself.
It's been a pleasure diving into Jane Austen with you. Until next time, happy reading.